A father was seeking justice for his lost daughter. For 4 years, unanswered questions, unhealed wounds, and a case that was looked at in the wrong way. The real killer had always been there. When a hacker uncovered hidden secrets, the true face in the darkness was revealed. Laura was protecting someone. But who? And why? Justice sometimes takes time. But it never disappears. The truth is now coming to light. Martin was a 45-year-old former police officer. He had worked in the homicide division for years, solving the most complex cases, chasing criminals, and fighting for justice. But when life dealt him its cruelest blow, everything he knew was shattered. His daughter, 18-year-old Laura, was suddenly murdered one night. Just like that. A senseless death with no apparent reason, an unanswered death. Martin's world was destroyed that day. He found himself in a deep whirlpool. He dedicated his days and nights to finding his daughter's killer. For 3 years, he gathered evidence, questioned suspects, and followed clues on his own. But no matter how hard he tried, the case was never closed. The killer was never found. And it was that day that Martin realized how cruel justice could be. But for him, this loss wasn't just an investigation, it meant the loss of the meaning of his life. Over time, his anger consumed him. Whenever a new clue led to a dead end, Martin lost his patience. Everyone in the department noticed he had changed. The old, calm, smart detective was now a nervous, aggressive, obsessive man. The management thought his obsession had gotten out of control, so they removed him from his position. Once a skilled homicide detective, he was now just a regular officer tasked with filing papers in the archive. For Martin, this new life felt like a prison. He wasn't out in the field anymore. He couldn't inspect crime scenes, talk to witnesses, or solve cases. He was only left with dusty files and a suppressed anger. But what really ate him up were the unanswered questions. The only thing he had learned in those 3 years was this: sometimes, some questions can never be answered. But was that really true? Was it? Or had Martin just been forced to accept that he couldn't find the answer? Maybe there was a truth hidden among the files that he hadn't noticed yet. It had been exactly 4 years since the incident. 4 long, dark years. Nothing had been the same since Laura's death. Martin's life had been shattered along with his daughter's. Her death was not just a loss, it was the collapse of Martin's entire world. His obsession, anger, and hopelessness had consumed him from the inside. Day by day, he had pushed everyone around him further away, condemning himself to loneliness. Even his ex-wife, who had once tried to support him, had realized that Martin had become unrecognizable. His old warmth, his protective nature, and the time he once devoted to the family had disappeared. He had become obsessed with finding his daughter's killer and forgotten everything else. Exactly 1 year ago, his ex-wife had said her last words to him: "You didn't just lose our daughter, Martin. You lost yourself too. You're not living with us, you're living in her shadow. I can't reach you anymore." And in the end, she had completely left him. When the divorce papers arrived, he had signed them indifferently, as if handling an old case. But when the divorce became a reality, what hurt him the most was that his son had also chosen his mother. His 12-year-old son refused to even speak to him. The child who had once been his hero now treated him like a stranger. Every time Martin looked into his son's eyes, he saw nothing of himself there. Only disappointment and anger. As if he were looking at a stranger who had lost everything for his daughter, not his father. And so, Martin realized, the killer hadn't just taken Laura from him. He had destroyed his life, his family, his identity too. All that was left was a man, lost in the shadow of the past, with an unsolved case and no awareness of how much he had already run out of time. Martin came to the archive, just like he always did. His eyes were bloodshot from sleeplessness, his shoulders slumped, and his face carried the weight of the years. When he opened the door, the heavy air inside was just as it always was, dusty shelves, old files, and the never-ending silence. Today had started like any other day. But nothing was ordinary for Martin. Today was the 4th anniversary of his daughter's death. No matter how much he tried to push this truth to the deepest corner of his mind, the emptiness inside him never left. He slammed the door shut, tossed his bag and coat carelessly into a corner. He collapsed into the chair, burying his face in his hands. There was no one else in the archive. Ever since he'd been condemned to work here, no one had stepped into Martin's world. He took a deep breath. The same question kept spinning in his head: are some questions' answers really impossible to find? But suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted. Footsteps. Martin quickly lifted his head. No one should be here. Most people had even forgotten this section existed. But the door cracked open, and someone entered. A young woman, she was about 30, with very short hair. Tattoos were visible on her arms, and she wore comfortable but unusual clothing. Anyone who saw her wouldn't think she was a police officer. Martin frowned. With the exhaustion and prejudice inside him, he turned directly to the woman. You must have come to the wrong place. This is the archive. The woman tilted her head slightly, giving him a sarcastic smile. Unfortunately, I'm in the right place. She said calmly. I'm from cyber crimes. I need some data from before the digital era. I need to look through the archives. Martin was surprised. Why would someone from cyber crimes be looking for work in the archive? What she referred to as before went way back. His eyes scanned her clothes and demeanor once again. You don't look like a cop, he muttered. The woman had already noticed this look. She rolled her eyes, pulled her ID card and police badge from her pocket, and placed them on the table. I'm Sophia, from the Cyber Crimes Unit, she said confidently. Martin glanced at the ID. It couldn't be fake. But the doubt inside him still didn't fade. Sophia moved to the other side of the table and looked directly at him. The more you get to know me, the more you'll realize that some things are more than just appearances, she said with a slight smile. Martin took a deep breath. He had felt today wouldn't be an ordinary day. And maybe Sophia's arrival would be the beginning of something much bigger in his life. Martin sighed deeply and stood up. He knew Sophia's job wouldn't be easy. Documents from before the digital era, forgotten cases, dusty files. This was a place no one visited, a place where the past was buried. He quietly led her down the long archive corridors. The heavy smell of mildew rose from the shelves that hadn't been opened in years. There was a dense atmosphere here, carrying the marks of worn-out paper, ink, and history. Sophia stopped in the middle of the corridor and turned her eyes toward the massive bookshelves. The shelves were lined up like a cemetery. Dust-covered, old files with faded labels held forgotten stories inside. This was the tombstone of cases that justice had never found. Martin noticed the slight anxiety that appeared in Sophia's eyes. The woman sighed and shook her head. This might never end, she said, her voice carrying a hint of pessimism. Martin smiled with a slight smirk. Everyone who comes here says that at first, he said, glancing over the shelves. But in the end, they find a story in every file. And sometimes. He paused for a moment. Sometimes, the past brings unexpected things to light. Sophia fixed her gaze on Martin. Then I hope the past has something hidden for today, she said. As Martin looked at Sophia, a feeling of unease filled him. His own past was also here, lying somewhere deep in this cemetery. And maybe, today, it was preparing to rise again to disturb him. Martin left Sophia among the dusty files. Without turning back, he called out in a half-distracted voice, I don't have much to do, I'm leaving. Sophia looked up at him, surprised. She hadn't expected him to leave so easily. She knew he was a man condemned to work here, but he seemed to be walking away as if nothing mattered. She silently watched Martin walk away. With the opening and closing of the door, the silence of the archive settled again. She was alone. Only the dusty files, old cases, and the traces of the past accompanied her. She sighed and tried to focus on her work. But for Martin, this was an escape. With painful steps, he left the archive, leaving the silent corridors behind. He quickly got into his car. He placed his hands on the steering wheel and started the engine. He didn't even need to think about where he was going. He knew. The cemetery, Laura's grave. As he drove, his eyes were distant. Even the quiet music playing on the radio couldn't stir any emotions in him. A few minutes later, he pulled up to a flower shop. He stopped the engine, sighed, and got out of the car. He opened the door to the small shop, and a faint smell of flowers filled the air. His eyes scanned the flowers on the shelves. He chose the white ones, pure, beautiful, fresh. Just like Laura. He took the flowers to the counter. The saleswoman smiled gently at him, but Martin didn't respond. He handed the flowers to her. "Can you make a bouquet?" he asked, his voice quiet and tired. The woman nodded and got to work. While he waited, Martin stuffed his hands into his pockets and took a deep breath. When he arrived at the cemetery, the air was heavy and gloomy. Gray clouds covered the sky, and the wind howled between the gravestones. Martin walked slowly. His steps were heavier than usual. When he reached Laura's grave, the pain inside him surged like waves. He gently placed the white flowers on the grave. For a moment, his fingers traced the petals, as if he were touching Laura. He silently looked at the gravestone. The letters on it had faded a little from the years, but her name was still there. Laura Schneider. She was 18. She would never grow up again. The same question echoed in Martin's mind. Justice, the thing he had chased his whole life, the thing he had fought for countless people. But he couldn't bring it for his own daughter. Was this irony? Or a slap in the face from fate? He had solved the most complex murders over the years. Every crime had a trace, every killer had a mistake. But in Laura's case, there were gaps, an unexplained void. Evidence, clues. Everything had turned into dead ends. He tried to suppress his anger. He took a deep breath as he stood up. He sensed movement at the corner of the cemetery. A black, luxurious vehicle had quietly parked. His eyes narrowed. No one should be here. No one would wait in a place like this. His instincts immediately went into high alert. Martin began walking toward the car. As his steps quickened, the car's headlights lit up. For a moment, he thought he might see the driver, but just then, the car suddenly accelerated. The tires scraped the wet ground, the engine roared, and the car sped away. Martin froze for a moment. His hands clenched into fists. He had become paranoid over the years. He knew that. Maybe this was just a trick of his mind, an irrational delusion. But his old instinct. Detective instinct, it told him this was no coincidence. When Martin returned to the archive, he found Sophia lost among the files. The woman had her head down, carefully looking at an old document. But there was something Martin couldn't miss. In the cold archive, Sophia's forehead was dripping sweat onto the file. This was strange. The archive was cold. No one would sweat here. Was she anxious? Was she tense? Martin didn't ask. Instead, he returned to his own work, moving between the shelves, knowing he wouldn't find a clue about Laura's case but getting lost in the files anyway. A short time later, Sophia took her jacket and quietly left. Days passed. Sophia continued working in the archive. Martin and she barely spoke. They both seemed trapped in their own silent worlds, but that evening, things changed. After finishing work, Martin saw Sophia. The woman was walking toward a luxurious car. The car had tinted windows, so he couldn't see who was inside. But Sophia's nervous demeanor was noticeable. She was arguing with someone inside the car. Who was this man? Martin stopped for a moment and watched. But then he shrugged. Sophia was tough. Whoever she was arguing with, she could handle it. She had the potential to have issues with anyone. It had started to snow. The city was covered with a white blanket. Martin decided to visit an old friend's bar, one he hadn't seen in a long time. After parking his car, he started walking through the alleyways. As the snowflakes fell silently, the night felt unusually calm, and then, he heard a scream, a woman's voice. Martin instantly went on high alert. He headed toward the alley where the sound came from, and what he saw shocked him. Sophia, man had her pressed against the wall. He had a knife. The woman was clearly resisting, but the attacker was strong. Sophia was squirming, trying to escape, but she wasn't succeeding. Without blinking, Martin moved into action. He lunged at the man. In one move, he grabbed his wrist, made the knife fall to the ground, and slammed the man to the ground with a sharp motion. The attacker stumbled, and as Martin took control, he shouted, "You're coming with me to the station." But Sophia gave an unexpected response. "No." Martin turned to her in surprise. "What?" Sophia shook her head firmly. "Let's go, Martin," she said in a determined voice. Martin looked at her. This man wasn't just a random criminal. If he had been, Sophia would never have hesitated to arrest him. But she didn't want to. There was something more to this. Martin postponed his questions for the moment. He quickly walked away with Sophia through the alley, heading toward his friend's bar. Once they entered, Sophia wearily sat in a chair. Martin sat across from her, crossed his arms over his chest, and asked directly, "Tell me. What's going on?" Sophia looked at him for a moment, took a deep breath, and then looked away. "First, thank you," she said. "If you hadn't come, I would have been kidnapped." Martin's face grew serious. "Who was that man, Sophia? And why didn't you want to take him to the station?" Sophia placed her head in her hands. Looking into Martin's eyes, she said because, this is much bigger than you think. Martin took a deep breath, placed his hands on the table, and carefully looked at Sophia. "All right, go ahead. Tell me," he said, patiently. Sophia tilted her head slightly. She had realized there was no point in resisting. "I work in the cyber crimes unit, yes. But I never went to the police academy." Martin frowned. This wasn't too surprising to him. The woman's demeanor reminded him more of someone accustomed to the harsh realities of the street rather than discipline. "I see," he said, waiting for her to continue. Sophia took a deep breath and went on. "I'm a hacker. I'm self-taught. First, I started working with the police as a freelancer. Then they brought me in. But, she paused for a moment. Sometimes, I try to deliver my own justice. And that's why I get into trouble." Martin squinted his eyes. "What do you mean?" Sophia bit her lip, clearly afraid Martin would judge her. "I know you won't support me," she said. "But that guy from earlier. He works for someone. A real criminal. He's been involved in every dirty business for years, but the police have never been able to catch him. Every time, he gets off thanks to his lawyers." Martin sighed wearily and shook his head. "Sophia, what did you do?" Sophia avoided his gaze, as if she already knew what Martin's reaction would be. "Well, what do you do when someone can't bring justice through legal means, Martin?" she asked, looking at him as if challenging him with her eyes. Martin fell silent. He knew this all too well. Some criminals were truly untouchable. Sophia answered her own question. "You damaged their personal life." Martin raised his eyebrows. "How?" Sophia gave a slight smile, not bothering to hide the mischievous side of her. "Hacking the guy's phone was a piece of cake for me," she said, shrugging. He was cheating on his wife with countless women. So, I threatened him. He doesn't know I'm a cop. I made him an offer. If he surrendered, this information would stay secret. But if not, Martin finished the sentence. You sent everything to his wife. Sophia shrugged, like a mischievous child, nodding. Martin closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and then couldn't hold back the laugh that came from within. How big of a fish did you get yourself tangled with, Sophia? Sophia avoided his gaze, but eventually, she was honest. A pretty big one. Martin shook his head. Can't they do something? Really? They had a knife to your throat, Sophia. Sophia was silent for a moment. Then, her eyes met Martin's, filled with sincere gratitude. But you saved me. The silence lasted for a few seconds. Sophia looked at Martin with gratitude. Thank you, she said in a soft voice. Martin looked at her for a moment, then tilted his head slightly. Don't thank me, Sophia. Because you've gotten yourself mixed up with someone, and I feel like this is just the beginning. Sophia looked away. Because Martin was right. This was just the beginning. Martin was feeling frustrated. Sophia's nonchalant attitude was triggering something inside him. Getting involved with someone that big and being this relaxed about it. He narrowed his eyes and looked at her. I think you should stay safe until you fix this situation. Sophia shook her head, a slight smile appearing on her face. Don't worry, I've gotten myself into trouble before. Martin sighed. That's not courage, Sophia. That's stupidity. Sophia smiled faintly, but the seriousness in Martin's eyes made her realize this wasn't a joke. She left some money at the bar, gave the bartender a brief glance, and stood up. We're leaving, she said in a determined voice. Sophia raised an eyebrow in surprise. Where to? As Martin put on his coat, he turned to her and answered without hesitation, to solve this. To the archive. Sophia paused for a moment. Martin's gaze clearly showed what he was planning. He wasn't going to let this go. Sophia tilted her head slightly, her eyes shining with excitement. Finally, Martin's instincts had kicked in. Then let's start, she said and followed Martin. This was going to be a long night. When they arrived at the archive, Martin wasted no time. He pulled out a whiteboard, just like the old days, and asked Sophia for the man's file. Sophia hesitated slightly, pulled a USB out of her bag, and plugged it into Martin's computer. His whole record is here, she said. Nothing official, but unofficially, it's all here. Martin moved to the front of the board. He wrote the man's name at the top, he began adding his crimes, connections, and the sentences he had avoided underneath. His eyes sparkled as he brainstormed. This was the old Martin, just like before, he was breaking things down, focusing on details, and moving forward step by step. But this time, he wasn't solving a murder. This time, he was looking for a way to lock a criminal genius up. The man's power was clear. He had gotten away with every crime, most likely, he had become untouchable through bribes, connections, and money, but no criminal is truly untouchable. Martin fixed his eyes on the board and turned to Sophia. Can you access his phone? Sophia narrowed her eyes. I can. But why? I want to track him. Martin said with a firm tone. For a few days, I'll follow every step he takes. How he bribes people, who he meets, who's behind him. We need to learn everything. Sophia looked at him. There was unease in her eyes. Finally, she took a deep breath and shook her head. Martin. You don't have to do this. You're in charge of the archive. If the management finds out you've taken on a case, they'll fire you. Martin looked into Sophia's eyes and smiled faintly. Only if we fail, he said. When Sophia understood what he meant, she lowered her head. Martin was really in this now, and then Martin's voice echoed again, "You'll stay at my place, Sophia. Until we take him down." Sophia looked at Martin in surprise. She was facing someone who was genuinely invested in the cause for the first time. Although Martin didn't notice it, something inside Sophia, something she hadn't felt in years, began to emerge. A sense of security, and Martin was completely unaware of it. Martin started tracking the man. Along with the data Sophia had gathered, he began following the man's daily routines. But soon, he realized that there was much more going on than Sophia had known. This man wasn't just a criminal. He was a shadow walking among death. Martin understood this when he followed him all the way to the hospital morgue. The man entered the autopsy room, walking through cold, dimly lit corridors, and Martin, hidden in a corner, watched. Inside, one of the hospital's forensic experts was there. He seemed to be a man who had been doing this work for years, tired, his eyes exhausted. Martin focused even harder to understand what was going on. The man pulled out a thick envelope from his pocket and handed it to the coroner. The coroner hesitated for a moment. He paused. But then, with trembling hands, he took the envelope and quickly put it in his pocket. Martin's blood ran cold. This bribe wasn't just something random. This was to cover up the dead. This man's dealings were sinking into an even deeper pit than Sophia had imagined. She thought he was just involved in bribery and money laundering. But what Martin was witnessing now? This man's business was leading to people's deaths. This wasn't just about financial crimes. This was about murder. Martin swallowed. He realized just how deep they were in. And things were getting a lot more dangerous now. Martin got in touch with his old homicide team. There were still a few people who trusted him and were willing to talk. He shared Sophia's gathered information and his own findings. But most importantly, he presented the evidence of what he had seen. The photos he had taken at the hospital morgue, the bribe given to the coroner, were all the proof they needed. He had learned the coroner's name. The homicide team sprang into action. The investigation began. And within a week, it became clear just how dangerous the man really was. The homicide team launched a major raid. The man was connected not just to money laundering and bribery, but also a series of murders and human trafficking. The evidence presented in court was so strong that even his best lawyers couldn't save him this time. When he was brought to trial, the man's face was pale. He no longer had power. It was clear the court would show no mercy. He had ruined many lives, but now there was no escape. Sophia watched everything unfold in astonishment. She had just wanted to expose the man's dirty dealings, but Martin had done something much bigger. Maybe he had saved many lives. Even Sophia's. Because when the police thoroughly searched the man's house, they found Sophia's photos. The man had targeted Sophia. If it hadn't been for Martin, if these events hadn't unfolded the way they did, Sophia would likely have been the next victim. But she was safe now. The man's wife had already fled the country. However, she was being sought by Interpol. After all this, Martin returned to the archive. When he opened the door, Sophia's face was filled with gratitude and admiration. Martin furrowed his brow and looked at her. This was thanks to the homicide team. "You don't need to thank me," he said with a distant expression. But Sophia, without taking her eyes off him, "No," she said in a firm voice. "If it hadn't been for you, no one would have suspected the murders." Martin paused for a moment. He had spent his whole life seeking justice. Sometimes justice was incredibly hard to find. But this time, he had succeeded. And maybe, for the first time, he truly felt that he had saved someone. After everything, Martin found himself at the bar. He wanted to clear his head. Yes, he had done something good. Justice had been served. But the anger inside him still hadn't faded. Because he couldn't do this for his own daughter. This thought was driving him mad. He sat alone in a corner, focusing on his drink. The usual buzz filled the bar, laughter, glasses clinking, people having careless conversations. But Martin heard none of it. His mind was still in the past. And then Sophia showed up. Martin looked up in surprise. "What are you doing here?" "How did you know where I was?" he asked. But as soon as he asked the question, the answer came to him on its own. "Of course." Sophia gave a slight smile and shrugged. "Sorry, I got worried when you didn't answer your phone." Martin sighed. "Please stop hacking my phone," he said, shaking his head. Sophia laughed lightly. "I didn't hack your phone, I hacked your car's GPS," she said, moving to the other side of the table. "What are you doing here alone?" Martin laughed. But the laughter was filled with anger. His nerves were frayed. "What's it to you?" Sophia narrowed her eyes. "I want to talk," she said seriously. "Why did they lock you in the archive? I've never seen a detective like you before." Martin twirled his glass in his hand and gave it a slight shake. Though he wasn't drunk, the looseness from the alcohol was there. And at that moment, he revealed his deepest wound. "I couldn't solve my own daughter's murder," he said in a hoarse voice. "Don't tell me I'm good at my job." Sophia's color drained. "Laura." She didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," she whispered. But Martin didn't answer. He looked at his glass, as if he could see the past inside it. Justice had been served. But sometimes, it was too late. And for Martin, that was the greatest punishment. Sophia took a deep breath and looked at Martin. There was determination in her eyes. "I can help you," she said calmly. But Martin's face immediately fell. The anger inside him surfaced. "No," he snapped harshly. "You're not going near that dark file, Sophia." Sophia took a step back. Martin's voice was tense enough to shatter the glass. She knew what this case meant to him, but she wasn't ready to give up just yet. Martin angrily grabbed his jacket and walked to the door. As he left, without even looking back, he said, "You're safe now. You can go home." And slammed the door behind him. But Sophia didn't leave. She spent the night in the archive. She was alone. She spread out the files, reviewing Laura's case. As her eyes scanned the pages, something stirred inside her. Laura's death story was horrific. Sophia couldn't even begin to imagine what Martin had gone through. But something bothered her. Laura's phone records. The phone was completely clean. No messages, no photos, the call history was almost empty, but one detail didn't escape her. The memory usage listed in the file, more than half of the phone's storage appeared full. But there was nothing inside, ***, this couldn't be possible. Sophia immediately began her investigation. The phone wasn't in the evidence room. Because Martin had taken it from there. He was obsessed with his own daughter's case. He had kept the phone more as a father than as a cop. Sophia made a plan. The next day, she went to Martin's house. When she knocked, Martin opened the door with a weary expression on his face. "What do you want, Sophia?" he said, clearly still angry. Sophia shrugged and said nonchalantly, "I came to get my things." And walked inside. But her real purpose was different. She quickly headed to Martin's bedroom. She scanned the room, her eyes locking on a box under the bed. Just as she had guessed, Laura's files, evidence, and most importantly, the phone were there. Sophia took the phone and quietly put it in her bag. She left the house without drawing Martin's attention. When she returned to the archive, she got straight to work. The phone had been examined by IT experts before, but nothing had been noticed, and here was the detail that Sophia hadn't missed: 2 calculator apps. Who would need 2 calculator apps? This was a hidden storage app. The phone looked empty, but the real data was inside the calculator. Sophia took a deep breath and opened the app. It asked for a password. Her eyes were fixed on the screen. Why had Laura used her phone like this, and more importantly, what was inside these hidden files. Sophia quickly managed to crack the calculator app. And everything was there. Threatening messages, photos, conversations. All the evidence was revealing the horrific truth behind Laura's death. But the most surprising thing was something that emerged from Laura's messages. Laura had been protecting someone. Sophia's blood ran cold when she saw the number in the messages. Laura had been protecting her mother. Sophia couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen. Laura's mother, Martin's ex-wife, had been using illegal substances. Laura had found out, but she never wanted her father, Martin, to know. In one of the messages, Laura had written to her friends, "I'll never let my dad find out. No matter what, I'll protect my mom." The story was getting darker. Laura had argued with the person selling substances to her mother. She knew he was dangerous, and she had tried to get him away. Sophia stared at the screen for a long time. With this information, the case needed to be reopened. But the problem was, there was no one at the station to listen to Sophia. So, she went to someone else. Sophia knocked on the door of one of the country's most powerful lawyers. Her father, Christian. He was the lawyer for celebrities, politicians, and billionaires. His connections were powerful. But Sophia hadn't spoken to him in years. And now, she was using making peace with her father as a bargain. "I'm asking for your help for Laura's justice," Sophia said, looking him directly in the eyes. "If you do this, I'll make peace with you." Christian stayed silent for a moment. Then he nodded slightly. "If this is really that important, then I'll do my part." He set all of his connections into motion. And the case was reopened. Martin was shocked when he received the news from the police. He had made sure this case wouldn't be forgotten for years, he had done everything. But now, someone had reopened the case file. Who? How? Without a second thought, he rushed to the police station like the wind. He wanted to know about the new evidence. And when he found out, his world was shattered once again. His ex-wife, Laura's mother, was using illegal substances. Laura had found out, and she had wanted to protect her. But the worst part was, Laura had been killed by her mother's drug dealer, right on the street where they lived. And Martin's ex-wife had known about it from the beginning. Martin gripped the edge of the desk. He knew this. And she hadn't said a word. All those years, she had stayed silent. Martin's insides filled with anger, sorrow, and regret. This woman had protected his daughter's killer. And now, justice would be served. The case that had gone unanswered for years was finally solved. Laura's mother, Martin's ex-wife, was sentenced for evidence tampering. And the real killer was sentenced to life in prison. As Martin walked out of the courtroom, tears were streaming down his face. For years, he had been lost in this case, following every lead, never giving up on seeking justice, even when he was on the brink of madness. But now he understood. While trying to find his own daughter's killer, he had probably slept in the same bed as a woman who knew about the murder for an entire year. He had been abandoned, drowning in his own pain, while the woman had only watched. Realizing this was the greatest punishment for Martin. But now, everything was over. Here is the translation of the text into conversational English. After the trial, Sophia noticed that Martin had disappeared. But she knew where he was. She drove to the cemetery in her car. Her gut told her that Martin wouldn't be anywhere else. And she was right. In front of Laura's grave, Martin's car was parked. Sophia suddenly remembered. 4 years ago, on the anniversary of Laura's death, that black car had been waiting at the corner of the cemetery. Even then, Martin had been following. For him, this case wasn't just about saving Martin, it was about giving him his life back. Sophia got out of the car. When Martin saw her, he wasn't surprised. His eyes were red, but this time not from anger, but from peace. Sophia slowly approached. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Without taking his eyes off the grave, Martin spoke with his first truly sincere smile. "Sophia. Thank you so much." Sophia turned to him in surprise. Martin took a deep breath and for the first time, felt like he was free from his burdens. "I feel like I can finally live." And in that moment, Sophia realized that Martin had truly come back. Time passed. Thanks to Sophia's father Christian's connections, Martin returned to the homicide division. Years later, he was no longer just living to survive. He was living. His friendship with Sophia continued. They had both saved each other. Martin had learned that the pain would never completely fade, but life still went on. Because, in the end, justice had been served. And Martin now felt like he was truly living. Really. Finally. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. Every day, I share immersive and exciting stories for you. Your support means the world to me. Thank you.